I have several readings to share with all of you this morning. My first reading that I want to share is from the Gospel of Mark, and I'm reading from the New Revised Standard Version. Mark chapter 4, verses 35 through 41. On that day, when evening had come, Jesus said to all of them, "Let us go across to the other side." And leaving the crowd behind, they took him with them on a boat, just as he was, and other boats were also there with them. A great windstorm arose, and the waves beat onto the boat, so that the boat was already being swamped. But Jesus was in the stern, asleep on the cushions. But they woke him and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" Jesus woke and then rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." And then the wind ceased, and there was a dead calm. And he said to them all, "Why are you afraid? Have you still no faith?" And they were filled with great awe and said to one another, "Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?" And the second reading I have for all of you is from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 14, verses 22 through 33. Immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead to the other side, while he dismissed the large crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone. But by this time the boat was battered by the waves and was far from the land, for the wind was against them. And then early in the morning, Jesus came walking toward them on the sea. When the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified and said, "It is a ghost," and they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid." And Peter answered him and said, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." And Jesus said, "Come." And so Peter got out of the boat and started walking on the water and came toward Jesus. But when he noticed the strong wind, he became frightened, and then he began to sink, and he cried out, "Lord, save me." And then Jesus reached out his hands and caught him, saying to him, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" And when they got in the boat, the wind had ceased. And those on the boat worshiped Jesus, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." I struggled a little bit with this message for all of you this morning. The two passages I shared just a few moments ago, which are perhaps just different versions of the same basic story, they're both about storms. They're both about fear. They're both about even despair. And messages that are about joy are easier to write because it's easier for all of us to talk about joy. Messages about sorrow, about the hard times, those I find much more difficult to write. But sorrow is as much part of the human experience as happiness. The struggle is so very human. It is part of all of our experience. No one listening to this message has not lived through a storm. And for many of us, we are living through a storm right now. Peter steps out of the boat and walks toward Jesus, walking on the water. But then the wind picks up, and suddenly he is terrified. He reaches out desperately, and Jesus catches him up. And he says to Peter, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" I know exactly why Peter doubted, because we are all familiar with the concept of drowning. Most of us know the truth that terrible things are not extraordinary, but are ordinary parts of human experience. Peter fears because we all know that we can die and that we will die. Peter fears because the storm is all around him. Peter fears because pain and horror and grief are real. Peter fears because life is hard. Life is hard. We are in a raging storm right now as a country. Some have been in this storm much, much longer than the 5 months that we have been in the throes of this pandemic. Systemic racism has been a ravaging evil within our country since before it even was a country. And although I know a lot of white Americans have just started talking about the Black Lives Matter movement, have just started learning about our racist history, have just started to learn about their own part in systems of racism, even though this has maybe been new for a lot of people, it is not a new thing. Violence, including violence against Black Americans, violence at the hands of the police, this is a long part of our history within our country. Hate and violence have been lurking around the corner of our experience as Americans since as long as there has been a United States of America. Sickness, too, is very familiar to us. The opioid epidemic was destroying whole swaths of our country long before any of us started wearing masks or washing our hands. Children being held in cages, schools targeted by homegrown domestic terrorists, white men with assault rifles. This is all part of who we are as a country. This was the storm that was raging around us long before we even entered into this pandemic. I have been in full-time ministry for over 7 years, and in those 7 years, I have heard countless stories of human suffering, the relationships that were lost, the abuses that people have suffered, the illness and loss of loved ones, the loss of hopes and dreams, of jobs and opportunities, all of the small and big ways that people are hurting and in pain. There are storms all around us. There are storms within us. But this moment is new. It's new and is unprecedented in some specific ways. Unemployment in our country is devastatingly high. And our economy is like this close to complete and total collapse. And we are so very, very sick as a country. We've had over 150,000 people die from COVID. We have almost 5 million cases of COVID in this country right now, and the numbers grow by leaps and bounds every day. We are so sick as a country, and we are grieving, and we are lonely, and we are so, so tired. We miss our families, our grandchildren, our cousins, our grandparents, nieces and nephews. We miss gathering for meals with our friends inside our houses. We miss going to weddings and memorial services. We miss hugs. A lot of us miss hugs a lot. We miss living without worrying if we will be the next person diagnosed with a case of COVID. We miss the easy way that we used to go to the grocery store or go shopping at our favorite clothes store. We miss the time when our children could safely and without fear attend school. We miss being able to work for extended periods of time without being interrupted 100 to 150 times to have to get somebody a snack or break up a dispute about a coveted Lego piece. Maybe that's just me missing that uninterrupted joy of working for hours at a time without also having to watch children. I think many of us miss attending concerts or public events. We miss meeting for worship. We miss sitting on our beautiful benches with their blue-gray cushions. We miss hugging our friends after we exchange handshakes at the end of meeting. We miss laughing while holding cups of coffee and sitting in the parlor together, learning about something new. We miss shaking hands with our greeters and taking our bulletins at the door. We miss asking each other, "How are you?" and being able to give that person a hug when they say, "Not so great." We miss being in our hallways here, looking at the bulletin boards and seeing the pictures of the Brotherhood class that are hung on the walls. We miss being together. And even for those of us who are fortunate in this pandemic, who are fortunate to not be sick, who are fortunate to not have a loved one in the ICU or having lost a loved one, or lost our jobs, or having suffered the horror of being evicted from our homes, even for those of us who are so lucky during this time, there is still a storm all around us. And the waves are high and the wind is fierce. And for many of us, we're afraid. Even if it's just a small fear in the quiet hours of the night. And yet, Jesus awakes and the storm is all around him. And he rebukes the wind and he says, "Peace, be still." And the wind and the rain, they suddenly halt. And suddenly there's calm and the water is still. And Jesus walks to the disciples upon the water, incredibly, unbelievably, meeting them in the churning waves. "Don't be afraid," he says. And Peter is afraid. He's so very afraid, but he is trying desperately to trust. Peter, he is trying to trust like all of us are trying to trust. trying to find his footing on the uneven waves when everything around him is crashing and changing and moving. He is trying so hard to believe and to be hopeful. And then Jesus reaches out and holds him close when he starts to sink. Why did you doubt? Jesus says to him. And all around them, the water is quiet and still. I grew up swimming in the lakes of upstate New York. Many of those lakes are vast, very large. Some of my favorite lakes were in the Adirondack mountain range. They were ringed by mountains all around the lake. Other lakes that I swam in, the Finger Lakes, long and thin. They're surrounded by the lush green rolling hills of that part of New York. Sometimes I would swim in one of the Great Lakes, and the Great Lakes have waves like the ocean. But most of the lakes that I was in, the most growing up, they don't roll like the sea. Instead, they are either churned by the wind or they are still, very still. And when you wake up early in the morning and the air is cool, there's mist rising up from the lake. And if there is no wind, then the water is completely still and clear. There is a peace in the stillness of the lake when the water is still and clear and the mist is rising. There is a peace that is unspeakably lovely. And I imagine that it is this calm that is brought in the story by Jesus, this calm that is brought to the raging waters. It is a calm that reaches down deep within us, that soothes the part of us that we don't like to look at, the parts of us that are hurting or hurt, the places that are wounded so deeply that from day to day we like to just continue on as if we are not in pain. It is a calm that soothes those places within us, those places of the raging storm, the wind and the waves. And the truth of these stories is that the Spirit resides in the storm, not just in the peace that can come on suddenly as an act of grace. No, the Spirit, the divine, impossibly walks beside us, even in the churning, in the raging waters, in the mess of life. The divine accompanies us in those moments that are so unlovely, in the suffering, in the missing, in the loneliness, in the exhaustion, in the horror, in the anguish. The divine is there too, ready to gather us close and to speak to us words of faithfulness. We are never without the Spirit. We are never beyond the reaches of the divine. We are never truly alone in the storm, even though sometimes we may feel alone. And is that not the good news of Jesus walking upon the water? We are so prone, I think, to dismissing these kinds of stories because miraculous things are scientifically impossible. But although the story of Jesus walking upon the water is a story about something impossible and miraculous, that is not what it means. What it means is the divine is showing up for us. Showing up for us unceasingly, showing up for us impossibly and incredibly, showing up for us whether or not we deserve it, showing up even in the loneliest, rockiest, most painful moments of our lives, showing up for us and just waiting to gather us close if we need it, and to speak words that will quiet the storm. This is the good news that my heart needs right now. The good news of God's tenacious and universal love. The good news of God's unceasing faithfulness. And today I invite you, friends, to listen close, because even though the storm rages all around us and may rage within you, there is still that still small voice that is whispering to us words of encouragement and love, words that are tender and can bring peace and stillness to the storm. Words that remind us of our power and our courage and our resilience. May your storm be calmed. And when you are afraid in that storm, may you feel caught up by love's secure embrace.